we'll see if we're still clapping at the end. Anyway, it's a real pleasure to be here. I want to thank everyone here at Westminster for inviting me to talk to you today. I didn't realise you were all going to be first year students, or actually only just beginning your first year. But once I did realise that you were first year students, I put a question mark after the death of politics bit. Because there wasn't one there at the outset, and I thought, well, crikey, I don't want to scare the horses too much, so I thought I'd put a question mark after it. So, you know, what we'll be thinking about if we degree to which politics is dying. Or at least the way in which I understand politics anyway. And yeah, it's true, I've done loads of research and so on, but I do increasingly find my thinking, such as it is, motivated by stuff that's going on out there in the real world. Stuff I read in the newspapers, see on the television, conversations I have in the pub, all of those things as well, I suppose. So, you know, being badged a political theorist sounds like a very grand thing, but actually I do think we're all political theorists, we just don't realise it. And I think over the next 3 years what we folks are going to be doing is systematising to some degree the thinking that we're already doing, actually. And hopefully at the end of 3 years you'll realise that yes, I'm a political theorist too. I just didn't quite know it. So part of what I'm going to try to do today is to give you some sense of what that feels like, to reflect a little bit then on what one reads in the papers, things on the television, conversations you have with your friends and so on, and to try to think about ways in which political theory can inform that thinking, those conversations and so on, in a way that makes us to think about them more effectively and more systematically and more consistently, let's say. So clearly, if I'm going to answer this question, or if we're going to think about this question, the death of politics, we need to know what we think politics is. What's the subject we've all come to study here at Westminster? Not an easy question to answer, I don't think. But one of the people who I certainly hope you'll come across this fellow anyway at some point over the next 2 years, is Aristotle, right? Now, this is his view about, there's a picture of him, this is his view of what politics is. I'm just going to read this out, okay? I'm going to read it out fairly slowly. It might be the first political theory you've ever come across in your lives, I don't know. But hopefully it'll make a little bit of sense. What Aristotle here is asking himself is what makes a political animal. A political animal, as opposed to any other kind of animal, human or otherwise. What makes an animal a political animal? And this is his answer. He says man is by nature a political animal. It's his nature to live in a state. Obviously man is a political animal in the sense in which a bee, for example, is not, or any other gregarious animal. In other words, it's not just the fact that we're gregarious that makes us political animals. For the purpose of making man a political animal, says Aristotle, nature has endowed him alone among the animals with the power of reasoned speech. Speech, he says, is something different to voice, which is possessed by other animals as well, and used by them to express pain or express pleasure. Speech, he says, on the other hand, as opposed to voice, speech, on the other hand, serves to indicate what is useful and what is harmful, and so also what is right and what is wrong. For the real difference, he says, between man and other animals is that humans alone have a perception of good and evil, right and wrong, just and unjust. And it's the sharing of a common view in these matters that makes a household or a city. So that's what makes us political animals, or at least the capacity to be political animals. We have the power of reasoned speech, which horses, donkeys, all these other kind of things that have voice, they can express pain and pleasure. You know when you're hurting a horse, it makes a noise. But it can't, as far as we know, indulge in conversations about right or wrong, just or unjust, and so on and so forth. So that's one of the things that makes us a political animal, and also we have the capacity to share a common view of this. We can talk about this with each other, and that's what makes politics too, a common discussion about right and wrong, just and unjust, and so on. So I'm gonna hang on to that thought then about what politics is. I wanted to carry those two thoughts through the rest of this lecture. Politics is about matters of value, as well as it's about matters of fact. It's about ethics, as well as it's about matters of fact. And secondly, it's something that happens primordially in public spaces. It happens in public spaces. I'm going to hang on to those two thoughts for the rest of this lecture. That's what I'm taking politics to be about. Alright? I should say in brackets here, for the feminists and others on the see, that I don't think that politics only takes place in public spaces. I'm perfectly happy with that one of the thought that the person is political, and the personal relationships can be political as well as the kind of relationships one has in public, but I don't want to pursue that thought at this precise moment. So okay, so when I'm talking about the death of politics, the life or death of politics with a question mark, it's Aristotle that I have in mind. I find myself going back to him more and more, actually. when I'm thinking about what politics is, this thing that you're about to study. So we're talking about the capacity to speak the language of good and evil, right and wrong, just and unjust, and the creation and occupation of public spaces where we can discuss those matters. And in my view, and this is the thesis I want to advance to this afternoon, in my view, both of these pillars of politics are under threat, particularly in the UK today, the environment in which most of us live and work. More precisely perhaps in England, actually. We could discuss with this in the UK or England a little bit later if you wish, but somewhere around there anyway. It seems to me that both of these pillars are somewhat under threat. I don't know whether this is accidental, I don't know whether it's deliberate, I don't know whether someone kind of scheming behind the scenes there, trying to get rid of these pillars that I think politics are founded upon. I'm not really too worried about that. I wouldn't align it to any particular political party, any particular government. It seems to me to be something that's been coming for some time, actually, and is now reaching quite significant proportions. So let me take the first pillar first then. Let me take this idea of right and wrong, just and unjust, and so on. In order to discuss this particular aspect of the death of politics question mark, I'm going to refer myself and us therefore to an area which I perhaps have something like specialist knowledge, which is environmental politics and policy, as already described to you. Okay, here's a really tough question. How many of you have we got? One. Yeah, we've got one. Okay. This is the next obvious port of call, isn't it? Yeah, we could argue about the numbers, but broadly speaking, if everyone lived like the average European, apparently we'd need 3 planets to live on. The story gets even worse, because if everyone lived like the average American, apparently we'd need something like 5 planets to live on. Now, if all that's true, that's worrying on the face of it. That's a concerning thought, I would say. We have 1 planet, and if we all lived like the average American, and even if we don't already, most people would aspire to do so, then we're going to need 5 planets to live on. Now, this is, I suppose, it is most bold, and that is most bold, the fundamental environmentalist claim that we consume and throw away too much stuff, given the finite nature of the planet on which we live. As I say, I don't want to examine that claim in detail today, but I do want to say something about some of its consequences. And one particular aspect of this claim, this environmentalist claim, was kind of, I think, overwhelmed all the others over the past few years. And that's the context and the claims around climate change, of course. Practically every government in the world, I think, now, is signed up to the thought that as far as climate change is concerned, business as usual is not an option. Business as usual is not an option because it leads us to 6 degrees of warming around the world, which would be an absolute disaster. So practically every government in the world then is looking for ways of reducing the carbon-related impact of people's behaviour on their environment and on their living conditions. And what I want to do just now is to focus on the question of how governments are doing this, how are they seeking to influence, affect our climate-related behaviour, and more particularly I want to think about how it is in the UK that the government is trying to influence our environment-related behaviour. And I promise you that once I've done that, I'll then come back to say something about the death of politics question mark. So let me introduce you then, first of all, to a document called Mindspace. I bet you haven't heard of this. Most of you probably heard of this anyway. Probably quite lucky if you haven't, in a way. But it is a very, very influential document. At this very moment, I assure you, there will be at least 10 civil servants reading this document, poring over it, trying to understand what it is, and thinking about the implications of this document for their particular line of work, whether it's transport, environment, health, whatever it happens to be. This is a document that's been doing the rounds of the civil service in the UK, in England certainly, and here in London, for the past couple of years at least. And the work that went into it was prompted by no less a person than Gus O'Donnell. So Gus O'Donnell, who is the head of the civil service, who is the most important figure in the civil service in this country. He wanted to, as he put it, review the implications of behavioural theory for policy making. And the idea was, and it is in the jargon, that he wanted to build capacity and capability in this area across the civil service. So all those departments of state with which you're familiar. And I can report actually, in a kind of very anecdotal way, that this is working. This is certainly having some effect, because in July this year I was invited to Ofgem, you know, the energy regulated people? I was invited to Ofgem to talk about environmental behaviour to some senior managers there about changing people's energy related behaviour. And every one of them, unlike you folks, was very familiar with Mindspace. They all knew it very, very well indeed. It was in effect their Bible. They had been asked, ordered, really, to read this text and to inwardly digest it and put it to action in their particular context, which is energy. So at least in Ofgem, Mindspace was very much the mindset of civil servants. Very much the mindset of civil servants, and more broadly, I would say that's still true. So what's it all about then, and why am I putting this funny looking document up on the screen in front of you this afternoon? Well, the focus of all of this is on influencing behaviour, as we've said, influencing people's behaviour in this particular, in the context of which I'm thinking environment-related behaviour, which, as the report says, is central to public policy. It's true, isn't it, that governments always try to influence our behaviour in one sort or another. You might say that's what governments do. But what the report does is to refer to two baskets of standard ways of influencing behaviour. The first bullet point is the first basket of ways of changing people's behaviour through legislation, that's to say law making, through regulation, through taxation, all these kind of rather blunt instruments, you might say, that kind of shuffle us into the kind of order that the government would like us to be in. Right? That's one package of ways in which behaviour might be influenced. Now, the report says, the Mindspace report says, that these ways of changing people's behaviour can be costly and inappropriate. I don't go into too much detail what inappropriate are. I guess it's just people don't like being told what to do. So we can't legislate too much, we can't regulate too much, because people feel they've got no choice then. They just have to do what they're told. Maybe that's what inappropriate is. Costly too. And then secondly, the second bullet point, the second package of ways in which people's behaviour could be changed, might be changed, is through incentives and information provision. Incentives like financial incentives, for example. I'll give you an example of that shortly in the environmental context. And just provide a bit of information. You know, this happens a lot, doesn't it? You see posters giving information about one thing or another, you know, how bad it is to drink because, this kind of stuff. Or at least to drink too much, anyway. As the report says in this particular context, in the context of incentives and information, the second package of ways of influencing our behaviour, they say that people don't always react in the perfectly rational way required of this model. Don't always behave or react in this perfectly rational way. You're giving information, but you just might actually understand it, or you might not like it, so you actually do something else. This is inefficient from the government's point of view, because not enough of us follow the cues that we're supposed to be following in order to change their behaviour. So that's the drawback of that way of changing people's behaviour. We don't always react perfectly rationally to it. Now this whole thing here, people refer to the incentives, or at least the Mindspace document refers to the second package here, the second bullet point, as being about changing people's minds. Hang on to that for a second. Changing people's minds. We'll come back to that in a minute. That's about changing people's minds, apparently. I'm not sure that incentives really are about changing people's minds, actually. But nevertheless, we'll hang on to that for a second. But I would like to just give you an example of what a fiscal incentive might look like in the context of environment-related behaviour. This is how fiscal incentives and fiscal incentives work in this particular context, and I'm sure you could all think of other ones. The idea is that you impose a fine, or a charge, or offer a reward. People react to the fine or the charge, react to the reward, and their behaviour will change accordingly. So, you want to buy a car. Okay, which one are you going to buy? There's one kind of car you could buy, one with enormous wheels and a massive engine and all that kind of stuff. And here's another kind of car you could buy, much more boring. Same colour, otherwise pretty boring, very small, tiny engine, all that kind of stuff. It's pretty clear from environmental, climate change point of view which car we should buy. It ain't the first one, it's the one at the bottom. So, what do? £500 a year car tax for the top one. How much for the bottom one? Well, depending, possibly nothing at all. Alright, so the theory then is that people respond to the fiscal incentive and everyone will buy the bottom car. But they don't, do they? Some people want the enormous one at the top for some reason or another, which don't have to do with financial incentives and disincentives, etc., etc. So the concern is then that people aren't always reacting in this perfectly rational way. I do wonder though whether this is a change in minds thing. This isn't really about changing people's minds, it's just, attacking people in their pockets, really, I think, isn't it? More than it is about changing minds. But let's leave that for the moment. Let's assume this is indeed a changing minds kind of way, about a kind of a way about changing people's environment-related behaviour. The mind space document, anyway, I just want to go back to this previous one here, refers to changing minds on the one hand and changing context on the other. Changing the context in which we make our decisions and in which we make our choices. And that's something I want to say a bit more about now. So tools, this is a quotation from the Mindspace document. Tools such as incentives and information are intended to change behaviour by changing minds. In contrast, the report goes on to say, approaches based on changing contexts, the environment within which we make decisions and respond to cues, have the potential to bring about significant changes in behaviour at relatively low cost. Shaping policy more closely around our inbuilt responses to the world offers a potentially powerful way to improve individual well-being and social welfare. That is the central message of the Mindspace document that civil servants around the country are reading at this precise moment. Focus on people's inbuilt responses to the world, because they offer a potentially powerful way to improve individual well-being and social welfare. And the bit I want you to notice here, if you go away with nothing else from this afternoon, the words I would like you to take away from this lecture today are the words inbuilt responses to the world. Our inbuilt responses to the world, not how we rationalise, not how we think, really, not the reasons we give, but our inbuilt responses to the world are what are key to the Mindspace document and therefore to the government's way of thinking about how to change our behaviour in all different contexts. Behavioural theory then, the Mindspace document, drills down into the so-called hardwired aspects of the human condition, the things we do without really knowing we're doing them, the hardwired aspects of the human condition. So the effects of behavioural theory, I think, the effects of behavioural theory as applied to politics is to bypass the need for giving reasons for policy. Bypasses the need for giving reasons for policy because it drills down into these hardwired instinctive aspects of who we are as human beings. So here's an example. Actually, it's not a picture of what I wanted, but I just wanted to think about, those of you who drive cars who know about this, who have been in them, sometimes you approach a roundabout and you go over these yellow bumps, don't you? And what we know about those yellow bumps, I guess, is they get closer and closer together as you narrow the roundabout. And apparently the instinctual feeling that you have as a driver is to slow down as that happens. So this is an example of behavioural theory in action on the road in front of roundabouts. That's what the behavioural theory says will happen to us, and that's why you come across these yellow lines on the way up to roundabouts. Just one example. There are lots of those, and I'll give you a couple more in a minute or two. Okay, this is sometimes called nudging. Now you might have come across that word. Has anyone come across the idea of nudging in policy terms? Has anyone else come across the idea of nudging? Okay, read the papers a bit harder and you'll probably come across it. Because it is there, I promise you. You don't read about behavioural theory, you do read about nudging. So, let me just say something about nudging in that case. This word has entered, I think, the language of policy making in the UK. People don't tend to talk about behavioural theory, as I say, they talk about nudge. And this is kind of how it works. It's named after a book by Thaler and Sunstein, which was published in 2008. And this is kind of how it works. Think about your favourite supermarket. If indeed you have a favourite supermarket, you may not have such a thing. But if you do, think about it, and think about what happens to you when you go in it, without knowing it's happening to you. You're asking to reflect on something you can probably do instinctively now. Okay, now, experts in consumer behaviour, and therefore us, when you think about it just for a couple of seconds actually, know that our behaviour is affected by the way in which the supermarket is designed. We're encouraged to buy this thing rather than that thing by the sighting of the shelves, by the sighting of the signs, by the smells we encounter, by the sounds we hear, and by the direction in which we walk around the shop. Those things affect us without us knowing that we're being affected in the way in which the supermarket designer is hoping and believing and indeed known that they will be affected. This is called choice architecture. This is the changing context, or the changing minds idea. We're not being encouraged to buy one thing rather than another because we think it's a good idea to do so, but because we're encouraged to do so by our context. Right? This is choice architecture. That's what it's called in the Nudge book. But that's what increasingly policymakers in this country are talking about. Designing the context in which we make our choices. This has also been called libertarian paternalism. Oh God, it's libertarian paternalism. Sounds like a contradiction in terms to me. How can you be paternalistic on the one hand and at the same time be libertarian? How can you tell people what to do on the one hand and at the same time allow them to make choices? But nevertheless, the claim made in this book is that that's the beauty of Nudge. On the one hand, it's libertarian because nobody is forcing us to buy apples rather than oranges. But on the other hand, we'll be encouraged to do so by the way in which the supermarket environment is being set up for us. Okay? The thing is, it's not only supermarket that this is happening, of course. Those yellow lines on the road riding up to the roundabout are also full of choice architecture. And the idea is that we can roll out this idea into a whole stack of other areas of our personal and public life in such a way that we will be encouraged to do what the government would like us to do, but without really knowing that we'll be encouraged to do it. So this is from Paul Dolan, this is a quotation here, who is one of the authors of the Mindspace document. And this is what he says. He says that Nudge provides, and this isn't on here, but I'll just read out the introduction to it. Nudge provides low-cost, low-paying ways of nudging providers, consumers and citizens into new ways of acting by going with the grain of how we think and how we act. So it goes on in simple terms, and this is a kind of rehearsal or a revision of what we've already seen. We can seek to change behaviour in two main ways. First, we can seek to change minds. If we change the way people think about and reflect upon things, says Dolan, then we can change their behaviour. The success, he says, of these kinds of interventions have been somewhat mixed. The government we don't always do what the government would like us to do. That's what he means, I think, by somewhat mixed. Second, he says, we can seek to change people's behaviour by changing their contextual cues, those contexts in which we make our decisions. If we change the choice architecture, then we can change people's behaviour. And it turns out, he says, that our behaviour is a lot more automatic and somewhat less reflective than we have previously thought. Now what this makes me think, at any rate, is that nudgers, Mindspace people, have pretty much given up on normative debate. They've pretty much given up on trying to give reasons, ethical, value-based, morally informed for why we should do one thing rather than another. They've given up, in other words, on what Dolan calls the changing minds approach to politics. That seems to be much less interesting and important than it did at some point. This is because of its results, as Dolan says. Instead, Mindspace people, nudgers, seek to look at the world in the same way in which consumer experts look at supermarkets and our behaviour in them. An environmental example of nudging, which appeared on the Nudge website. There is a Nudge website, so if you're interested, do go and have a look at the Nudge website, Google Nudge, and you'll hopefully, you'll come up with something like this. I don't know what you call it. Google words, of course, on the web, but anyway, with a bit like that's what you'll end up with. But this was an example that appeared on the Nudge website not so long ago. And the idea is to make more people to recycle than just chuck stuff out, of course. So the idea is just simply to make recycling bins big and general waste bins small. Right? There's a simple nudge which encourages people to recycle more and chuck away general waste less. This is a change in the choice architecture. That's what this is. It's a change in the choice architecture in respect of throwing away waste or not throwing it away. Note again that this bypasses any reasoning process. Citizens are not encouraged to engage with the whys and wherefores of recycling. They merely respond more or less automatically to the prompts, to the architecture of the choices that they're given. Our actions, therefore, in that case, are instinctive rather than reasoned. And of course it might work. And you might think, well, as long as it works, what the hell? Well, I want to try to explain why, what the hell, is actually a question that's worth thinking about. This is one way, though, in which politics, I think, has been taken out of politics, as it were. Remember where we started? Aristotle's view was that politics is about good and evil, right and wrong, just and unjust. It's what makes us human. It makes us a political animal, our capacity to think in those terms. And here, on the other hand, we have a dominant view of policy making in the UK now, which takes exactly the opposite view, that we should avoid normative debate about reasons for why we should do things. We should avoid such debate in favour of inbuilt responses to the world. The problems with this are, I think, obvious on the one hand, and also, I think, important in terms of what it is that you're going to be doing over the next 3 years, academically that is, but also in your actual lives. And there's a relationship between the two. One problem is that in the long run, it might not work. It might not work in the long run. I'm prepared to admit that it will work in the short run, but in the long run, it might not work. Because what people are doing is responding to the choice architecture and not to the reasons for why it's there. They're responding to the prompts and not for the reasons that underlie the prompts. If you take the prompts away, if you change the choice architecture, if you put the apples back where the oranges are, people's behaviour goes back to where it was before, in the absence of having reasons for keeping your behaviour changed. So your behaviour will be changed only as long as the choice architecture is in place. Once that choice architecture is removed, or once it reverts to where it was before, your behaviour may well revert back to where it was before. Because you've got no reason to be otherwise. You haven't been encouraged to think about the reasons for your changed behaviour. I think it's actually the same, incidentally, with fiscal incentives. Remember the car example up there? What would happen if all of those fiscal incentives moved away? Would people who had learnt, as it were, to buy the small car continue to buy it? I think probably not. I mean, think of the congestion charge in London. It has changed people's behaviour driving in London, there's no doubt about that. But what do you think would happen if suddenly it was taken away? Would people go, oh yeah, that was a really good idea, let's get out of my car next time I'm going to go to London? I don't think so. Because they haven't been encouraged to think about why the congestion charge is there in the first place. I might be wrong about all that. I'm very happy to discuss it with you afterwards, but that's my suspicion. So that's one thing that's wrong with this, or one thing that's problematic at any rate about this approach, is that it might not work in the longer term, because people aren't engaging with the reasons for the change in choice architecture, but only with the choice architecture itself. The second problem, which is a bit more far-reaching, I think, is what if our inbuilt responses are objectionable? What if our inbuilt political responses on which this policy-making tool relies, what if they're not very nice? The inbuilt response position over the years has been used to justify a number of positions that most of us would now regard as unacceptable, from patriarchalism to racism and all sorts of places in between. So that's a concern as well, I think. The inbuilt response approach allows us too much license in that respect, we might say. I think we need to be ready to argue, to debate, at the level of values, at the level of ethics, at the level of norms. And the problem with nudging with behavioural theory is that it de-skills us, effectively. It takes away that skill, that capacity that we have. It doesn't allow us to practice it enough, we might say. So it's not just that nudging might not work in one area of policy or another, it's that there's a whole lot of collateral damage at the same time that people don't often think perhaps hard enough about. Nudging mistakes behaviour for politics. And I think I can perhaps illustrate this just one more time. The dangers of doing this anyway with an analogy. Earlier, just a few moments ago, I mentioned an environmental example, the changing the size of recycling bins as opposed to general waste bins. Think of slavery, in the same kind of context. What would the equivalent there be, I wonder? I suppose that we could have tried to reduce the amount of people manacled in the holds of slave ships by making the ship slightly shorter and slightly narrower. It might have had the same kind of effect, would have been a form of nudging in that context. But my feeling anyway is I'm not satisfied by that approach to slavery. There are two problems here. The first obvious one, again, is that it might not have worked, but the less obvious, and I think more far-reaching one, is that slavery is itself a moral and ethical issue that demands a moral and ethical response. So to deal with it only in behavioural terms is to deprive us, I think, of the language we need to confront it. The language of right and wrong, good and evil, just and unjust. So some kinds of issue, slavery is one of them, racism might be another. We can even think of lots of them. Some issues demand an ethical response. They have that demand, I think, built into them. So to respond to them in terms of inbuilt, instinctual responses is to actually misunderstand and to misunderstand their nature. Way back in 1949, a philosopher called Gilbert Ryle wrote a book called The Concept of Mind, in which he developed the idea of a category mistake. And a category mistake is where things of one kind are confused with things of another kind. And I think we've got that problem here when we're thinking about slavery, racism, etc., in response of just a behavioural response and leaving out the ethics and morals. They demand an ethical and moral response. So, okay, that's one way. What do we do for time? 10 minutes? Good, okay. That's one way in which politics is dying. The second half of this isn't as long as the first, I promise you. Crowding out, the way in which politics is dying, is that it's been crowded out at these very highest levels of policy making by the language and practice of behavioural psychology, behavioural theory. The second thing we learned from the quote from Aristotle at the beginning is that politics is something that happens primordially in public spaces. This is where people come together to decide what they ought to do as a collective. That's where we do it. Now I want to turn to this second aspect of the death of politics question right now. You'd have had to have been on another planet, I think, not to have noticed an upwelling of politics in this very sense earlier this year in what came to be known as the Arab Spring. Here's just a few pictures taken from cities all around that part of the world over the spring and early summer of this very year. Revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt, civil war in Libya, uprisings in Syria, Bahrain, the Yemen, and protests in a host of neighbouring countries. And what was really interesting, I think, was how this set off a chain of similar events in other parts of the world too. I just picked up two. Here's Madrid in 2001, the central square in Madrid. Jerusalem also 2011, campaigns around social justice and so on. Quite an extraordinary kind of upwelling. Almost all around the world actually, people who suddenly thought, I've had enough of this, don't really like what's going on around here. Where do they go? They go to the public square. They don't sit in front of the TV nattering over the dinner table, they go to the public square. It seems to be the most instinctive thing to do. When you're really fed up with the political situation in which you find yourself, you go and find a public square and you sit in it. With a tent up in it or something of that sort. The Cairo occupation of Tahrir Square was supported by lots of people, including the UK Prime Minister, David Cameron, and the rest of the coalition government. Of course, it was regarded as a sign of democracy at work, as a sign of politics in action, which it was. They were quite right about that. And in Libya, of course, support has gone as far as military intervention, even. So the UK government, as well as others, are taking this very, very seriously. And are very much in favour of this outpouring of politics in this particular sense of understanding what it is. So I do want you to note then where these actions, protests, took place. They took place in the squares and the public spaces of major cities. This, as I'm saying, is where people instinctively go when they want to protest at the state of the world, and when they want to act, as well as to talk in the language of right and wrong, good and evil, just and unjust, to quote again from Aristotle. So my case is that if we want to take care of politics, if we want to look after this thing that we're studying for the next 3 years, if we want to nurture it and look after it, we need to take care of our public spaces. Literally, take care of our public spaces. In fact, we need to take care of the very idea of the public. The very idea of the public. And this is the second cause for concern that I want to offer to you this afternoon. The contemporary assault on the idea of the public. At this level of analysis, by the way, the key political cleavage may not be between left and right, actually. It may be more between private and public. Of course, there's an alignment between the two as well, because the left is more often associated with the public than the private, but nevertheless, public and private seem to me to be absolutely key cleavage in politics today. So let's compare the UK political class's reaction to the Arab Spring with its reaction to homegrown protests. The protest here in England, in London, indeed. And I'm not talking about the recent riots, I'm talking about those if you want to, but I'm not talking about those at the moment. Cast your minds back to March the 26th this year, when the TUC organised anti-cuts protests that took place around the country, but mostly here in London. In the blogosphere, around that time, before the protest, there were calls to turn Trafalgar Square into Tahrir Square. That was the name of the square in Cairo where this whole thing blew up earlier this year. And that's exactly what happened. There's Cameron, by the way, in Tahrir Square, Cairo, you know, showing what a good lad he is, supporting politics, supporting democratic protest over there. Here's Trafalgar Square, 26th of March, 2011, everyone out there, you know, pretty much doing what they were doing in Tahrir Square. The reaction of the UK political class, of course, to the occupation of Trafalgar Square was rather different to the reaction to the protests in Tahrir Square in Cairo, rather different indeed. That's the occupation was supported by Cameron and the rest of the coalition government, but here's what happened in Trafalgar Square. Well, kind of predictable, I suppose, but certainly different. Now, from an Aristotelian point of view, I suppose most of the people that were thinking in these terms, but nevertheless, that's what we're doing here this afternoon. From an Aristotelian point of view, this clearing of Trafalgar Square is not just an inconvenience for the protesters, but an assault on the place where politics is carried out, and thus, you might say, on politics itself. Which might seem rather dramatic. You can see why you might be sitting there thinking, what's it all about? That's far too dramatic, surely. And of course the coalition government, you know, had a decent kind of case to make. Powerful arguments at its disposal. The government would point out that the crucial difference between Tahrir Square and Trafalgar Square is that in Cairo, the protesters had no other way of making their voice heard other than by taking to the streets. You develop liberal democracy, like this one. We have other avenues for voicing our protest and our concern. We have institutions of liberal democracy like elections, members of parliament and so on and so forth. True. But what if liberal democracy itself is the focus of your protest? What if you feel dissatisfied with periodic elections between parties that converge on a consensus that you'd rather see challenged than preserved? Once you're in that thought space, if that's where you are, then your demands are very similar to those of the protesters in Tahrir Square, because what you want is this. Now that's not a photograph from Tahrir Square, that's from Trafalgar Square. There's some very clever people there who are trying to echo the point made by the protesting movement. We want regime change. We don't just want a couple of MPs. We want to change the whole thing because we think it's corrupt and it's not working and it's unjust and all these other things that people might make about it. So you might say, why should the UK protesters have any less right to make this demand than Egyptians? And I think it is indeed when these very basic political questions are asked by ourselves and by others. How are we to organise ourselves that it makes sense to return to these original spaces and places of politics? It seems like so almost instinctive, almost an atavistic thing to do. So how are we to read the emptying of Trafalgar Square on March the 26th, 2011? And my suggestion is that we read it as an attack on the practice of politics itself. We're witnessing, I think, this is coming towards the end now, I promise you, we're witnessing a dramatic shift, I think, from public to private provision in the UK today. And my point is not really so much to ask whether this will work or not, but to think again about the collateral damage that this could cause. The idea of the public, as I've tried to explain, or view it anyway, is that the idea of the public is crucial to the idea of what politics is. We see public libraries closing. We see public funding being removed from universities. That's why we're here this year and next year, of course. Shall I take a year out? No. I'm going to go now. Otherwise it's going to cost me a very, very small, no, a very big fortune. We see healthcare being contracted out to private companies. We even see public toilets being closed down. Have you noticed this? I have. Those old Victorian public conveniences, as we quaintly call them, are closing down, one after the other. It's hard to find a place to go to the loo nowadays. It really is. And it's not that you, well, in public anyway. No, I don't mean in public. You know what I mean? No idea. It's not that you can't get books anymore. It's not that you can't get a university education anymore. It's not that you can't get healthcare anymore. And it's not even that you can't really go to the loo anymore. You can. In fact, let me just take up this last example, the loo example. I have to do this, I'm sorry. Because I think it's instructive. In March 2008, the then Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, Hazel Blears, local politician. I noticed that as Britain's urban areas were hosting ever busier crowds, daytime shoppers and nighttime revellers, as they're called, the number of public conveniences available to meet their needs was insufficient, according to the department's website. So something had to be done. What do we do? Well, the solution that Hazel Blears came up with is, I think, very instructive. Because what happened is that pubs, cafes, restaurants and shops are now paid by local councils to allow the public in to use their toilets. Kind of a PFI in reverse, the Public Finance Initiative in reverse, where public money is diverted to public enterprises so they can provide what is indisputably a public service. So you can still go to the loo, you just got to go to Starbucks to do it. And the price paid, I think, and you're going to say, God, I was reading 2 times of this again, that's what political theorists do, but the price paid, I think, is a further diminishing of the size of the public realm, and again of the very idea of the public. So as libraries closed, public funding is removed from universities, healthcare is contracted out to private companies, this I think is about much more than books, students and patients. It's about the steady erosion of the public sphere that sustains the meaning and practice of politics. Without the public sphere, we're left with the market, and we're left with the state and the government. Here's a very complicated map of the world. From a social scientist point of view, there are only 3 things to think about. But there's a 4th, it's families as well. But let's just have these 3 for the moment: the state, the market, and the public sphere or civil society. At the moment, the government in general, not just this one but other ones as well, is at the mercy, I think, of the market, which is why I put it in big font in big letters. Government policy is determined less and less, I think, by the democratic will of the people, and more by the pronouncements of unelected and unaccountable credit rating agencies. These agencies determine how much money governments can borrow and on what terms. And at the moment, the amounts of money that governments can borrow are very small and the terms are very harsh. So governments are forced into austerity measures. There's another word we're talking about nowadays, austerity. Look at Greece. Look at Greece at the moment. I think as of yesterday, they began to get rid of literally the first of a handful, 100,000 civil servants, because of the austerity measures they've been forced into. The cuts fall very hard on public services. So a vicious circle, or a vicious triangle actually, is established, in which the market determines the nature and extent of government, governments react by cutting back on the public sphere gets smaller and smaller, and the check on the market, the bottom left of the triangle, gets weaker and weaker. And the market gets stronger and stronger with every round of that dynamic. And in the end we have a world that's written in the image of the morals, ethics and practices of the market. Have you noticed everyone's a customer nowadays? Everyone is a customer nowadays. Passengers are customers on the train. Students are customers, increasingly. I even got a letter from my local council that referred to customer services. My local council, if ever to my old-fashioned mind, there was a relationship which cried out for the word citizen, as opposed to customer, it's my relationship with my local council. Because I'm not a citizen for them, I'm a customer. This to me is a very significant sign of how far market rationality and language have penetrated public life, that the word citizen has been expelled from the vocabulary of local politics. So, and this is my closing remark, I promise. Although I don't actually think that politics is dead, I don't think it's dead, I do believe that the process which could lead to its dying has gained considerable momentum over the past 2 or 3 years. So, for me, the real significance, I think, of Tahrir Square in Cairo, La Porta del Sol in Madrid, Trafalgar Square in London, is the resistance on display to that process. I think this physical reclaiming of public space is a reclaiming of politics itself in the face of depoliticisation. Thank you very much for listening.